Welcome everyone to this, what I'm sure is going to be a fascinating conversation about, are we equipped to deal with the current global terrorist threats? My name is Robin Wright. I am a joint fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I am delighted to be joined today for this conversation by Bruce Hoffman. Bruce is a senior fellow for counterterrorism and homeland security at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's a professor at Georgetown University's Foreign Service School. He's also a senior fellow at the U.S. Military Academy's Combating Terrorism Center. He has been a scholar in residence at the CIA on the subject of counterterrorism, an advisor on counterterrorism to the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq, and an advisor on counterinsurgency to the multinational forces in Iraq. Bruce's most recent book is Inside Terrorism, and another is The Evolution of the Global Terrorism Threat. I'm also very pleased to be joined by Colonel Chris Costa. He is a former special assistant to the president and senior director for counterterrorism. His 35-year career in government included 25 years in counterintelligence with the Army's Special Operations Forces, as well as a stint with the Navy SEALs Naval Special Warfare Development Group. He served throughout the Middle East, Central America, and Europe, and he earned 2 Bronze Stars for intelligence work in Afghanistan. He has been the executive director of the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. since 2018. So I want to begin our session with a broad question to each of you. I'll start with Bruce. You have been tracking the patterns of terrorism now for at least 4 decades. We recently marked the 20th anniversary of 9/11. What are the top ways, feel free to list as many as you think are relevant, that international jihadi terrorism has evolved since 9/11? And how has more broadly the nature of the threat changed? How has the scope of the threat evolved? Over to you.
Thanks, Robin. The simple truth of the matter is that, unfortunately, 20 years after the apocalyptic 9/11 attacks, the threat posed by Salafi jihadi terrorist groups has spread both numerically and geographically. Numerically, in the sense that 20 years ago, we in essence had one enemy, more or less in one place, and that was Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. 20 years later, we have 2, perhaps not robust, but still existent Salafi jihadi terrorist movements, not just Al-Qaeda, but its even more savage progeny, the Islamic State or ISIS. According to the Department of State's list of foreign terrorist organizations, we have 4 times as many designated foreign terrorist organizations today of a Salafi jihadi ideology than we had on 9/11. We see that each of these movements have both spawned a series of branches or franchises that unfortunately extend from North Africa to Southeast Asia and from the Caucasus to Southern Africa. So clearly, 20 years into the war on terror, as many people are attempting to walk away from it or to precipitously declare some kind of victory, I would argue we're in a more dangerous state today than we've ever been in.
So just let me follow up on that. We're now in kind of the 3rd generation, maybe even moving into another generation. Can you reflect for a second on how mobilization has changed in terms of who's recruited or how wide the aperture is on trying to bring in fighters, how much faster the recruiting has been, and maybe a change, how their agenda has become more and more ambitious or aggressive or radical?
It's just that, one has to start really with the Taliban takeover or its reconquest of Afghanistan in August 2021. I mean, that has been a fundamental game changer. Whatever came before that, I'm not even sure matters really. But the fact that their determination, their resiliency, their ability to resist the combined might, not just of the world's most technologically advanced military in the history of mankind, the United States, but our many European and other allies that participated with us as part of a coalition in Afghanistan, has been just a tremendous boost to the fortunes of this movement. It shows that if you're patient enough, if you would remain resolute in the face of what, after all, is a divinely ordained struggle that mere mortals do not have the right to abjure from or to leave, you too can be triumphant. The fact that now Pakistan is entering into negotiations with its variant of the Taliban, which is one of that country's arch enemies, I think, unfortunately and tragically, on the 20th anniversary, or just after the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, underscores, firstly, how far we still have to go in this war that many wish to put in the rearview mirror. And secondly, I think the real problem is for the adherents of this very broad-based and increasingly inclusive ideology that's Salafi Jihadi, that's Deobandi, that combines extremism and an assault on the Western liberal values that have really guided and one would have hoped has improved the world, presents us, I think, with a very formidable challenge that as I've said, many want to leave behind and don't reckon. So I think the bottom line is we still don't understand and we still haven't experienced the full repercussions of the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan. I think first and foremost, the problem we face is that Ayman al-Zawahiri's very quietist strategy of rebuilding in the background, of being very patient, has been crowned with success. So this can only attract more recruits and more supporters to this movement, and I would say revive al-Qaeda.
So, Chris, you have an extraordinary resume. You served in the previous administration and with special forces in Afghanistan, the first Iraq War, in the last century, the second Iraq War in this century, as well as in Bosnia and Panama. How has the U.S. adapted its strategies to deal with the changes in the nature of the threat? And more broadly, how well is the U.S. doing, especially given the outcome of America's longest war in Afghanistan?
Robin, first of all, I want to say it's a pleasure to be here today, to be among friends with Bruce Hoffman and to speak at this forum. So let me dive in by a preface right up front. As a departure point, I want to just frame what I dealt with my team on day one of the Trump administration in 2017. We had a palpable threat against commercial aviation, a significant threat stream. At the same time, really in the first week of the administration, we had to execute an intelligence raid against al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula or not execute that raid. A decision needed to be made. We subsequently recommended that the president approve that particular operation. Tragically, we lost a Navy SEAL. Thirdly, we understood that we had to rapidly accelerate our defeat ISIS plan. At the same time, this was complicated by hostages that were held by terrorists from North Africa, from the Maghreb, all the way to Pakistan. So that was what I call week one problems. All of that said, the good news is there was a remarkable continuity between administrations, from the Bush administration to the Obama administration to the Trump administration, and candidly to the present day. It remains to be seen, but there seems to be a continuity of counterterrorism thinking with the current administration. Now, from an adaptation standpoint, right up front, we recognized early on in the Trump administration that we could conduct discrete counterterrorism operations in the absence of large troop movements, invasions of foreign countries. That's not what we wanted to execute. In short, no large-scale deployments. We recognized we could conduct successful counterterrorism operations with foreign partners. In fact, they're indispensable partners like the Syrian Democratic forces on the ground in Syria. But parenthetically, and Bruce just got to it, we have foreclosed that idea of the options that we had with small footprint by having no footprint currently in Afghanistan. I also want to make the point that we focused an awful lot, and I think some of your other questions will get to this, but we focused a lot on militarized solutions. aggressive battlefield operations to attrit our adversaries. At the same time, it's important to point out that no administration has really gotten to root causes. So I will freely admit, I walked into the White House with an understanding that we would have to ramp up our counterterrorism pressure on our adversaries, but at the same time, I wanted to focus very much on root causes. There just wasn't the luxury of time based on the exigency of the circumstances that I laid out. Insofar as mistakes and missteps, I mean, I've alluded to it, the idea of invasions, in particular Iraq, and this isn't, hindsight is 2020. Although I served on the ground in the second Gulf War and the first Gulf War in Iraq, and I would serve there again if my country asked me to. At the same time, it was a distraction from the fighting that we were doing in Afghanistan. It became over time, and some of this sounds cliche, like the other war. So I think we lost some focus, and much has been made of that in terms of what's happened recently on the ground in Afghanistan. But costly invasions really distracts long-term from the counterterrorism fight. The biggest lesson learned in total really is the idea that the future landscape really requires spending more time on those things I alluded to: terrorist legal rights, humane disposition of terrorist detainees, root cause issues, including doing far more thinking on the radicalization process, on understanding the ideology. It's mind-boggling at this point that I'm still thinking in terms of the need for the US government to understand how to counter radical Islamist ideologies, but we still haven't mastered that. We're just scratching at the surface. So all of this is with the advantage of hindsight, but that's how I would address your very good question.
Could I jump in for a second?
Sure.
I mean, and I'm delighted to also to be with my old friend, Chris Costa, and especially with you, Robin, who's one of the most expert people on these issues too. Chris raises, I think, two very important points. Every US president, and it's now four that is engaged in the war on terror, has been very good in leading the tactical dimension of this, in keeping the homeland safe. And that's an important criteria. Unfortunately, it's not the other one. Where I think we have failed, and Chris really zeroes in on this, is in the implementation of some strategy, a strategy that not only addresses all the things that Chris describes, but also counters the narrative and counters the ideology, which has shown tremendous resilience. We've been really good kinetically at weakening, whether it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda or their franchises and affiliates. But where we've been less good is breaking the constant cycle of regeneration that enables them to replenish their ranks and carry on the struggle. After all, and what they see is the best way to defeat us is not militarily head on, but through a war of attrition. And the second point, and here I really want to pay tribute to Chris, when he went to the White House, he took the lead in developing a counterterrorism strategy that was certainly as good as any of its predecessors, that was actually promulgated in October 2018. But this is always the problem. We have great strategies, and they're ones that combine the non-kinetics with our kinetic strengths. It's getting the administrations and getting the government machinery to implement those strategies that have proven so elusive. And I think explains in large measure why we're still fighting this war 20 years later.
So I think you both mentioned something that's so basic that we tend to forget, because we do approach this problem so often through military means. How are we going to, kill off a leadership or prevent a military attack, whereas we don't deal with the alienation and the political or social or economic issues that lead to marginalization of parts of society, who then look for an alternative, and they find that there's no political middle ground under autocratic rule, and so they will join extremist groups. I think this has been the pattern, Shiite, Sunni, in virtually every state. It's true in the West, where you find the radical components, the lone wolf attacks sparked by the alienation of people. who also feel that they just haven't been included in society. So, I'd love to have both of you address. So how do you deal with these root causes? I mean, that's a really long-term generational problem that we don't seem to be willing, with governments that are only 4 or 8 years in power, to really tackle in a significant way. The only thing we do is kind of nation build in terms of an alternative in the place where that has originally nurtured the militants, and that certainly hasn't proven to work very well either. So Chris, do you want to start since you brought it up?
Yeah, well, thank you. And I would just make the point that, again, no administration has satisfactorily got at it. I think there is some time and there is some space to really focus the machinery of our government, our diplomatic means, our intelligence services working with liaison services. There isn't the crescendo of the threat that there was in 2017. And none of that was histrionic. It was fact. When I walked into the White House, we had those significant threat streams that we were able to mitigate because of overseas kinetic action. All of that said, I think things, although are unsettled in the immediate aftermath of what we just saw play out in Afghanistan, there is some time and there is some inclination of a new administration, a relatively new administration, that I think is really set up mentally and conditionally to focus on root causes, because they certainly advocated it in the previous administration, the Obama administration. So some of those same actors that served for a time in the Trump administration, really, it is now their opportunity to focus on those grievances, to work with foreign partners. Some of that work happened in the Trump administration, working with Saudi Arabia in particular. On counter-radicalization, working with the Kingdom of Jordan. I just think there is more work to be done. And Robin, you get to the heart of it. There's a lack of patience for these kinds of things. And this is a long-term problem. But I think the United States recognizes we're not going to deploy troops in large-scale fashion any longer. So we're going to have to be more efficient. We're going to have to be smarter, and we're not going to solve the root cause problems alone. That's not a unilateral problem. It is a multi-country problem, and it's a multi-dimensional problem.
Yeah, it's a global problem now. Bruce, do you want to address that?
Well, I'm far less optimistic than Chris. In the sense that I recall very clearly in 2004, a gruff former United States Marine who was no softy, who was then a senior intelligence officer, observed to me back then, 17 years ago, we don't have enough bullets to kill all of our enemies. We've got to find a different way. And this is the problem, we never have. And, the point is that we have never really focused on the non-kinetic side because the metrics are so elusive. We don't know if we've turned someone away from terrorism. We don't know if we've diverted someone from the path of radicalization. So therefore, we've consciously chosen, despite what our strategies emphasize and encourage, really to turn our backs on these non-kinetic tools, which after all is how we won the Cold War. We didn't defeat the Soviet Union in combat. It was through ideas, and it was through resourcing and prioritizing the information war. And that's something that I think, because it's not as compelling in the 4 years of a presidential administration or the 2-year term of a member of the House of Representatives, you can't deliver on the metrics of having turned people away. But what we're finding is that it's just as important as ever. What worries me now is that for the first 20 years of the war on terrorism, the United States was indisputably in the lead. But I think the way that we have mishandled the withdrawal from Afghanistan and our credulous negotiations with the Taliban over 2+ years has really left many of our allies in Europe, and in particular in the Middle East, and especially on the Arabian Peninsula and surrounding areas, very doubtful of whether the United States still wants to lead, is still in a position to lead, or whether the United States is so politically polarized and divided that we're incapable of doing so. And that's going to be a huge challenge. We were in the driver's seat. I'm not so sure that we're going to be in the future.
So what struck me about your comment was that you talked about the United States working with Saudi Arabia on de-radicalization. When you're talking about dealing with one of the most autocratic regimes in the world, trying to de-radicalize people who are alienated by that autocratic system. I mean, we're kind of in a cycle that may be hard to break, because there are more and more autocratic leaders or failed states in the Islamic world, and the danger is that if people don't feel that there's a way, there's opportunity in life, that they look for places where that will bring them in, give them power, give them a paycheck. But let me switch to a kind of different tack, because we spend so much time talking about jihadi extremism as if that's the only threat in the world when it comes to extremism. Right-wing extremism is also a threat too. So, Bruce, give us your sense of where, why, and how right-wing extremism is a threat, and how does it differ country to country, whether it's the flashpoints or the economic, political, and social conditions in which it emerges?
Well, if we've already painted a remarkably bleak and melancholy picture of the threat coming from Salafi jihadi, your question underscores precisely the challenges we face today. 20 years, at least from the US perspective, our enemies were foreign, not domestic. I mean, very clearly now, not least because of the events that we saw on January 6, 2021. Our enemies are also our own fellow citizens. So this is an enormous challenge at a time when the emphasis of now 2 administrations in a row is to deprioritize counterterrorism, to turn to great power competition, to, of course, the challenges of climate change, the challenges of a global pandemic, the challenges on a daily basis of cyber attacks and ransomware. I mean, we have a very full waterfront we have to cover, not least with domestic terrorism. And I think the threat, at least in the United States, is highlighted in 2 respects. Firstly, on January 6th, insurrectionists, or whatever you want to call them, in Washington, D.C., achieved what al-Qaeda couldn't do, which was to penetrate the citadel of American democracy. We know that, or we strongly suspect, we may never know definitively, the 4th plane, United Airlines 93, was en route to the Capitol. But on that day, our own citizens breached the Capitol, sullied and soiled the citadel of democracy, and I think sent a very profound message that we have to pay attention to domestic threats as well. Certainly in climates of economic uncertainty, and the COVID pandemic, beyond any doubt, has created that. Certainly what terrorism worldwide always achieves to do is to undermine confidence in elected leadership. I mean, we saw that demonstrated so visibly on January 6th. What terrorism always seeks to do is create profound divisions within societies. We saw that evident as well. So that what I'm saying is that the legacy of 9/11 extends directly to 1/6. And we see how people seek to take advantage of this lack of trust, this lack of confidence, to create the chaos and to accelerate this chaos and disorder in a way that they hope will benefit their causes. I mean, in the United States, I think this is cut of a number of different cloths. What I find so worrisome is that we don't take a hard look in the mirror sometimes. Throughout the war on terror, and especially in the beginning, we accused many other countries in the Arabian Peninsula and South Asia of exporting these violent ideologies, of not doing enough to control their own citizens and this free expression of hatred and intolerance. The US has become an exporter of these ideologies. I mean, look at the QAnon phenomena. I always thought that was uniquely American, to be enveloped in conspiracy theories that are completely divorced from reality. I mean, a pedophile ring of Democrats operating out of the basement of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. I mean, seems incredible. But we now see how QAnon has spread to Germany and has played a role in the recent German federal elections, how it's taken hold in Scandinavia, in the United Kingdom, in Russia, and elsewhere. And of course, terrorism thrives off of conspiracy theories, on assaults on the truth, and again, of this sowing of doubt in elected leadership. And we see that at a very unstable time that has been rubbed raw by 2 invasions and occupations of other countries, by this ongoing, still unresolved war on terror. On top of that, now the climate degradation that we see unfolding across just the United States alone so dramatically this summer, and the COVID pandemic, that it's breathed life into these fringe movements. And unfortunately, made them respectable in the eyes of politicians in multiple countries. Unfortunately, this isn't only a phenomenon that's affecting the United States. And again, what Chris was talking about earlier about addressing root causes, and what I was talking about in terms of how important the non-kinetic approaches are. I mean, once again, this underscores that we have to have a much more holistic and a much more coordinated strategy for dealing with threats, both domestic as well as foreign.
Wonderful. So, Chris, you've been both a tactician and a strategist. So let me ask you, what are the tools to counter right-wing extremism? Are they any different from dealing with other types of extremism? What's been tried and worked, and what's been tried and failed to work? I'd be interested, given your experience, to compare the different types of extremism in terms of looking down the road as well.
I appreciate the question, Robin, and I should acknowledge right up front that I've gone to school, on Bruce Hoffman, on understanding, try to reconcile my experiences overseas, and then trying to square that with understanding far-right radicalization. So in the past few years since I left the US government, I focused a lot of my time and energy trying to understand this dynamic, and again, reconciling it with my experiences overseas. So the terrorist violence is, in short, it's mutating. Far-right extremists are organizing the way jihadists used to organize, or presently are organized. And Bruce also hit an important point. 9/11 is an indelible marker in the arc of counterterrorism or terrorism history. Similarly, January 6th is tragically another marker for understanding really domestic violent extremism in a new way, because there are going to be some disoriented Americans, tragically and sadly, that are going to move from across the ideological divide from demonstrators to violent actors. But to address your question more directly, the tools are the same, but let me just parse that out a little bit. First of all, investigations and arrests are going to be a key to going after domestic violent extremists here in the United States. Investigations, prosecutions, and punishment, right? So the FBI and other entities of US federal law enforcement are going to have to redouble their focus as they are now. And they were when I was in the Trump White House. They're going to focus on violent white supremacists. They're going to look for a nexus also with overseas actors. We'll talk about that in a minute. But again, root causes, as Bruce has said, we have to focus with a nuance on a more holistic root cause focus. It's not going to be just on some of our diaspora communities where we're looking for would-be jihadists. Now we have to identify with white supremacists who are exercising their freedom of speech that might cross that ideological divide, from freedom of speech in hate language to mobilization for violence. So investigations coupled with, again, a renewed focus on root causes, but also broadening that focus to include white supremacists. That's critical. The third is strategy. And we've already talked about the importance of having a national counterterrorism strategy. And candidly, the Biden administration in the first 90 days published the nation's first domestic violent extremism, domestic terrorist strategy, however you characterize it. And that's very important. So that really set conditions for the first priority. Of course, publishing a strategy is one thing. Now we have to implement that strategy, and we have to measure success. Based on investigations, based on arrest, based on disrupted attacks, et cetera. Switching gears, the fourth tool is terrorist designations. Canada declared the Proud Boys a terrorist organization. We're not going to do that here in the United States, and we shouldn't do that because it could potentially politicize domestic terrorism, and that is fraught with danger, in my humble opinion. All of that said, we can designate terrorists overseas, like the Russian, or organizations like the Russian imperial movement that trains in Russia, a white supremacist organization that's connected with Americans. We can go after the Russian imperial movement with sanctions and use our intelligence authorities to focus on understanding who are those Americans that are connected to this organization that professes, violent undertakings, et cetera. And I guess the last point, and this might seem very macro, but I think it's worth making. This, again, may seem very basic, but we need national leadership. As I said, terrorist labeling in the domestic context is crucially important, because we can absolutely, as a nation, get it wrong. We can make the mistake of labeling someone a terrorist who has a very, very far right perspective, but certainly doesn't want to execute political violence. So there's a lot of nuance there, and it's fraught with peril. All of that said, jihadism and accelerationism is threatening to white supremacists, just like jihadists are threatened by our society. So it's really two sides of the same coin. And as I indicated, many of the tools are the same, but there's a lot of nuance, and we have to tread very carefully as we focus on American citizens that may radicalize for political violence.
Yeah, so one thing as you're talking about both the two sides of the same coin is that there's also the common problem, and that's that sense of alienation among both jihadis or right-wing extremists, that
Right.
They don't feel included, they don't feel part of society, and so they go off to create their own societies with a different vision and the willingness to use military means. So let me turn back to you, Bruce. One of the most interesting trends that has evolved over the decades has been the splintering or fracturing of extremist movements. We tend to think of them all as you said, jihadis or Salafis, because of their the sect that they, or the rigidity of their belief systems. But Al Qaeda in Iraq, spawned ISIS. And now ISIS is the biggest threat, a franchise of ISIS is now the biggest threat to the Taliban. Now that we're out of Afghanistan, you see a kind of one jihadi movement against another jihadi movement. So why this split? And to what long-term impact? I mean, is this something that let them all kind of fight each other? Is this one way that you kind of diffuse the focus on us and let them focus on each other? But what is the phenomenon? What are the dangers among kind of extremist groups generally? When you look, it's true to a certain degree of right-wing extremists too. They fragment and they become rivals, whether they fight each other or not. Bruce?
In my view, splintering is always a sign of trouble. Now, on the one hand, you can look at it and say, well, the parent organization or the central organization is appreciably weakened when it cannot maintain any kind of cohesion, and when it spawns these factions that break away. And that's, in essence, it's not an all bad news picture, but I think it's one that we have to be very cautious about, because the problem is that the splintering, I think, indicates two things. Firstly, the resilience and the resonance of an ideology. It's not that the ideology of these groups are changing. Al Qaeda and ISIS's ideology and even their end game is exactly the same. I mean, it's very clear. It usually is tactical differences. And often those tactical differences is because the parent organization is attempting to link means to ends and to control violence, and the factions are just more savage and more barbaric. And that's the big problem, is that usually splintering indicates terrorist groups that are embarking on new campaigns of violence, and that they're using their stock and trade of terrorism, in essence, to gain ground or to compensate for their newness. Usually they're numerically smaller capability. So therefore, they have to out-terrorize in essence or engage in ultra-violence compared to their parent organization. And we see, I think, the corrosive effects of that happening right now, where groups that were once, we viewed with total, complete opprobrium, like the Taliban, for instance, like Al-Qaeda in some respects, are now seen as somehow more palatable or more acceptable. Or to use Al-Qaeda's own term, we see them as moderate extremists compared to their even worse depredations of their progeny. But we have to be clear, it's all bad, it's all horrible, it's all a theological totalitarianism.
Yeah. So, Chris, let me turn to you. The United States and France, as examples, have killed jihadi leaders, some of the most famous ones, bin Laden from Al-Qaeda, Baghdadi of ISIS, and most recently, France killed the ISIS leader in the Sahel. Yet all these groups are hydras. They simply replace one leader with the next. It doesn't seem to have as impactful a result as we might hope. How effective is killing the leadership in countering terrorism or extremism?
So disappointingly to some, I suspect my words will be troubling, because the bottom line is our euphemism for killing jihadi leaders was CT pressure. In CT pressure that you just alluded to or made reference to, it works. Killing terrorists is disruptive, it attrits them, and it's an important tool. That said, I want to step back and remind our listeners at the forum that I walked into the White House with the idea that I can focus more emphasis on other tools, that my team could truly focus on other tools to apply to this problem. But at the end of the day, there was no luxury for that. And we had to significantly attrit our adversaries. We had to disrupt their terrorist planning. And this isn't theoretical. I saw it play out. The threat to commercial airliners was tamped down, knock on wood. It will continue at a very low level because we put pressure on our adversaries, because we kinetically went after ISIS and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Unfortunately, as I've also said, we have spent far too much time on over-militarized solutions, and that continues to be problematic, as we've made that point throughout the course of this discussion. But we took away the physical caliphate, which also made the message of ISIS moribund. It took it away from them. They no longer had a caliphate that was their jihadist dream. We took it away. So in essence, kinetic operations led to counter-ideological, if you follow my logic. So we will continue to enjoy only partial success when we are able to make some of these organizations more local. And that is happening. That's partial success, that these terrorist organizations may no longer seek to come after the United States here on our shoreline. Now, that's not wishful thinking. It's quite possible that these organizations are going to focus more on local grievances. And that might be part of their evolution. We will see. So we'll need to continue to work with foreign partners. We'll continue to use small footprint of special operators. That will not go away. We're going to have to rely on our liaison services, foreign intelligence service relationships, and our intelligence sharing agreements. But at the same time, we are going to still need to continue to use CT pressure as a tool.
Yeah, I totally agree that the one thing, though, it seems, as listening to both of you, is that so often we are reactive rather than proactive. Reactive to whether it's a strike on us or trying to deal with a phenomena that already exists, rather than proactive in preventing the phenomena or the attack from happening. And that the terrorists or extremists seem to always have the initiative or the edge on their side. As the saying goes, they only have to be successful once, or we have to be successful every time. And I think one thing we need to point out is the caliphate may not exist. And I was actually on the front lines in 2019 when, as the ISIS caliphate fell in Syria, I was in with the Syrian Democratic Forces. But the reality is that there are still 18,000, an estimated 18,000 ISIS loyalists in Iraq and Syria. And then you have all those franchises. The thing that strikes me so much this year is I was in Mozambique in 1975 when it became independent from, from Portugal, Western colonial power at the time. It's 60% Christian. And yet this summer, the United States sanctioned the new ISIS franchise in Mozambique. So the spread of these groups, even though we've killed off its caliphate, you're right, the localization that ends up threatening allies and places that we think of as, not having that kind of threat. So it's a really interesting point. So let me turn to you, Bruce. I've now covered wars all over the world for 48 years, dating back to the 1973 Middle East wars. And the one thing that strikes me so much about today's wars, the 21st century wars, even late 20th century wars, is how many of them now involve non-state actors or non-traditional governments like ISIS or like the Taliban. What does this tell us, really in a big think way, about the pattern of warfare in the 21st century and the type of threats that either the United States, our allies, or the world more broadly will face going forward?
Well, I mean, your question follows on from your previous comment. And, one thing I would observe that the trajectory of terrorism over the past 70 years and the lesson for terrorists has always been to internationalize local conflicts as the surest way, from at least the terrorist point of view, of achieving success. And I don't think that's a pattern that's going to be reversed. The other side of that, I think, is to paraphrase the aphorism attributed to Leon Trotsky, is that you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And I would say that's the same thing with terrorism today, in the sense that we want to deprioritize it. We see many other challenges now competing for our attention, especially in national security. But I think, just as your question suggests, is that terrorism has become a fixture of both domestic and international security in the 21st century to an extent it wasn't before. That's not only because of the multiplicity and growth of non-state actors challenging established nation states or elected governments in particular, but other governments as well, but also because, at least in my view, you can't divorce great power rivalry from terrorism. Because what we've seen time and again in the Middle East and North Africa, and now in South Asia, when the United States withdraws, it creates a vacuum that our great power opponents in many cases seek to fill. Or it encourages local terrorist groups to try to seize that vacuum and create even more chaos and prolong the chaos with a view towards they're going to end up on top. So basically what we see is, yes, a threat from established nation states, peer rivals like China, for instance, that is causing us to focus on building up our blue water naval fleet, developing new sorts of combat aircraft. Absolutely. But we're going to have to do that in tandem with preparing to counter terrorism, not just from independent non-state actors, which has more or less been the pattern for the past 20 years, but in kind of a back to the future mode, to state sponsors of terrorism that can clandestinely and subversively will increasingly, if not directly, utilize or exploit terrorist organizations, but will encourage them to create the kind of chaos that seems to always put the United States and the West on the back foot, and that enables the forces of hatred, intolerance, totalitarianism to gain a foothold and then consolidate that foothold into a grip over an entire country.
So, Chris, you're again the tactician and strategist. How do individual countries, or how do coalitions of countries, or does the world in terms of its international institutions, act in concert to deal with these non-state actors or these non-traditional governments, whether they're on the right or the jihadis or anywhere else? It strikes me that that this requires different kinds of tools and different kinds of challenges than the kind of wars we expected through most of the 20th century, where you were dealing with the government and you negotiated through international institutions, or there were kind of rules of war. When with these non-state actors and non-traditional governments, none of that applies.
Yeah, so you make an excellent point, and that is the reality that we are very much focused, the United States, on understanding irregular warfare challenges, and which means that the kinds of relationships we need to have are going to be more ad hoc in the future. The kind of lessons that we learned through the 20 years of the counterterrorism fight are really important to carry forward. What am I talking about? Two quick points, two quick examples, and you know one very well. We've talked about the Syrian Democratic Forces. They're a non-state actor. There is no state of Syria or nation, or there's a nation, but there's no country, a Kurdish country rather. So it is a group of individuals that have supported the United States and a coalition in excess of over 70 countries fighting the counterterrorism fight on the ground in Syria. That said, they have been an important, in fact, a crucial partner. The second example, again, remains to be seen, but let's talk a moment about the Panshiris, right? In the Panjshiri Valley of Afghanistan, an opposition movement exists. The son of Shah Massoud is present there, and there are fighters that may be willing to fight against not just the Taliban, but ISIS-K. We're going to need to work with those kinds of partners. Those are just two examples of partners that we're going to have to work with in the future. The tools are more or less, again, they're the same, except for the partners that we deal with diplomatically. Intelligence sharing with partners are going to have to be modified to fit the circumstances on the ground, which means the United States is going to be far more unconventional in its approaches toward warfare. It seems counterintuitive as we're getting further and further away from the turn of the century, right? But the irony is we will continue to have to deal with partners that are non-traditional. And that means intelligence services will have to execute surgical and limited on-the-ground alliances, again, with non-traditional partners. That comes with risk. It remains to be seen, to put a finer point on it, how are we going to work with partners on the ground in Afghanistan? Or are we not going to deal directly with an opposition force that may sprout in the future if there's a humanitarian crisis or the Taliban is weakened based on being attrited by ISIS-K? You can pick the variables, but what is our foreign policy objectives, or what are our foreign policy objectives, and how do we conduct discrete CT operations in that kind of dynamic? I'm very much interested in more understanding of what over the horizon intelligence and counterterrorism operations really means practically on the ground.
Yeah, I think that's the question. We think of over the horizon, we're operating from afar, but does it also mean that we support local groups? The problem, I think, in Afghanistan is what had been the Northern Alliance that helped us defeat, or actually did defeat, the Taliban with our help 20 years ago, has kind of evaporated. That the Taliban outflanked them when it came to taking Afghanistan, to make sure that the Panjshiri Valley was not an enduring challenge. And unfortunately, Ahmad Shah Massoud's son has basically fled, as has the former vice president, who looked like he might be an opposition force as well. So we only have about 10 minutes left, and I have one last question for each of you. Let me turn to Bruce. In the 21st century, we face two existential threats in terms of, kind of physical, from the pandemic on one side, from the broader long-term issues of climate change. How might either impact extremism, whether the players, the issues, or the battleground?
Well, they already are. I mean, whether it's Salafi jihadis or domestic transnational violent far-right extremists, they're both seizing upon climate change and the pandemic to amplify their own message, to create new divisions in our societies, and to attract new sympathizers, supporters, and recruits. I mean, this is one of the oldest stories about terrorism, is that terrorists are the consummate opportunists. They're always looking to elbow themselves into the limelight by sort of piggybacking on or adopting some highly contentious cause that's being debated or discussed, and hijacking it for their own purposes. And we see this now, and we've seen it since the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and even more so because of the ecological challenges that the globe faces, with terrorist groups, whether on the far right or whether they're Al Qaeda or ISIS, touting themselves as somehow a green alternative to the ossified, to the unreliable machinery of whether it's, the values of the East, communism and the socialist state, or the failure of the Western democratic capitalist order. So I expect we're just going to see more of that, and they will continue to exploit it, especially in their constant ongoing search to identify and subvert new constituencies, and especially constituencies of young people, because of course it's young people that fuel terrorist movements.
Yes, and it's no coincidence that ISIS wanted to build a state around famous waterways that would provide sustenance, support for agriculture, or oil in the case of Syria. So it's an interesting point. So one last question to Chris, and this is an impossible question, but if there's anyone who can answer it, I'm hoping you can. How do these existential threats, the climate change and the pandemic, complicate the ability to counter extremism in any of its forms, jihadi or right-wing or anything in between? And how does the response, whether it's by individual nations like the United States or some kind of coalition, or by the world, international institutions like the UN, differ? I mean, what would you do, frankly, if you were in charge that's different from that's being done today?
So let me answer your last question first, because that's easy from my perspective, and I've reflected on it. So what needs to happen is the current Biden administration really needs to roll out a national counterterrorism strategy. They need to bring in guys like Bruce Hoffman and other experts in the field over to the White House, and they need to redouble their effort to publish a counterterrorism strategy. Why? Because all of the issues that I outlined are critical, they're dynamic, and the situation is changing. Not only is the threat changing, but now we have a significant change with regard to our force posture in Afghanistan. What does over the horizon mean? What do these non-traditional relationships and partnerships look like going forward? We need the policy prescriptions so that interagency can begin to implement that particular strategy with the appropriate resources arrayed against it. So the administration can be applauded for publishing a domestic terrorism strategy in the first 90 days. But what I am waiting for, and if I were in charge, I would be publishing an update to the Trump 2018 strategy, because that really framed a very cogent approach to countering terrorism, but the dynamic has changed. So it's very important that the future landscape is captured as well. And our international partners are very much waiting to understand, how are we going to lead? Is the United States going to lead? That's an important question that Bruce raised. I think the Islamist terrorist ecosystem is changing dramatically, and it's very important to update our strategy. The other points that you make are very important, or the questions you asked. The environment is extremely complex, and my metaphor for what needs to be happening is al-Hol, right? A camp that has held ISIS families up to 70,000. That's a bit of a metaphor for the different approaches to the ISIS fight. We need to ensure that it's an international approach. What am I talking about? So some countries took back ISIS fighters and executed. executed them. Some countries took back their people and they've been released. They've gone to trial. The United States is bringing people back, American citizens, putting on trial. In some cases, we're extraditing other citizens, like a Canadian, bringing them back to the United States, putting them on trial. Some countries have put their heads in the sand and said, hey, they're stateless people as far as we're concerned. It's not our problem any longer. That's a metaphor for the problem of terrorism writ large. It needs to be an international approach to a problem. These problems can no longer be handled exclusively by the United States. It's very clear we're no longer going to wield the biggest stick insofar as counterterrorism. So there has to be international approaches to this fight.
Yes, having been in Al Hol a couple of years ago as ISIS collapsed, it was electrifying. And you really worry about trying to put people in camps where the only thing that's happened is deeper radicalization, and particularly among the next generation. I think something like 65% of the inhabitants of Al Hol are under the age of 12. And when we're talking about how with each generation they become more radical, they're mobilized in half the time of the last generation, that there are real dangers down the road in terms of the kind of threats we face, whether it's at home or abroad. Listen, this has been a fascinating conversation. I want to thank both Bruce Hoffman and Chris Costa for discussing how well equipped we are to deal with terrorist threats of the future. I'd love to have this conversation go on for another hour, but I'm very grateful to both of you experts for this very rich conversation that I think will inform so many. I look forward to having it again sometime.
Same here. Thanks very much, Robin.
Thank you very much, Robin. It's great to see you, Bruce.
Same here, Chris.